to this STERIS Tech Talk. Today's topic is product and package testing to support medical devices. My name is Nate Wilhelm. I'm the manager of product and package testing out of STERIS's Brooklyn Park, Minnesota laboratory. I'm joined today by Phillip Roxby, who is the technical services manager out of STERIS's Galway, Ireland laboratory. Today's agenda, we're going to have a short introduction about STERIS. We're going to talk about why test and which test method should be used. We'll talk about sterile package testing, and then Phillip will talk about medical device testing. So my laboratory in Brooklyn Park, Minnesota, we have microbiological and chemistry testing to support STERIS sterilization services and validation services. We also offer disinfection efficacy testing, moist and dry heat sterilization services. We have medical device validation services, including reusable device qualifications, sterile package testing and validation services, which is the topic of today's webinar. And we primarily service the medical device and pharma industries. So why test? In short, because we're required to, but there's many different reasons why you might need to test. So pre-submission, there's R&D testing that might need to be done during the development of your product. You're going to need to have testing on file for your regulatory submissions, whether it's a 510K or CE mark or any other sort of regulatory approval. And also for marketing, your product's packaging and the product itself are going to have some unique characteristics that you might want to be able to market towards potential customers. And then after you have an approved device, you might do some testing to support a change. If you change a sterilization modality or if you change your packaging configuration, you're probably going to need to go back and repeat some of that testing to be able to submit again to any regulatory bodies to show that change hasn't significantly impacted your product's ability to function and stay sterile the way it should. Also, to support CAPA investigations or anything like that, you might need to do some additional testing. So the purpose of testing is to prove the safety and efficacy of your device. So safety being the proof that the device, including the packaging, is safe to use and that all identified risks have been mitigated. And efficacy meaning the proof that the device, again, including the packaging, performs as it claimed and intended. So which test methods are you going to use? So early on in the device design process, you really want to start looking at the different test methods that are available out there, which ones are appropriate for your product. That can contain both standardized tests, there's many ASTM test methods out there, for instance, and also unique test methods, particularly on the testing of the device itself. You may have some very specific things in your device that need to be tested that don't have a standardized test method. Those types of devices would require some extensive test method creation because it's a unique device that may not have a defined ASTM standard out there for that test method. So you're going to review standards and regulations, and you're going to develop a plan. So all of this testing is based on your risk assessment. The higher the risk, the more testing typically you need to do. You're going to define all that testing within your device and design specifications. And then you're going to go through your validation phase, and you're going to test your product and its packaging to ensure that all of the requirements that you have are met. So we'll talk now about sterile package testing. This is all based on ISO 11607. This is the principal guidance document for sterile barrier testing. So it's a packaging for terminally sterilized medical devices. This details all the requirements for validating the package for your device and all the test methods that can go along with that. This is required for regulatory submissions, so your FDA submissions, your CE mark, the essential requirements of European directives. The ISO standard lists out 123 different test standards covering 34 different types of tests. You won't need to do all those tests, but you'll need to do several of them at a minimum. So the main requirements of ISO 11607-1 The device and packaging together must ensure that the sterile medical device performs efficiently, safely, and effectively in the hands of users. And the sterile barrier systems must be considered an accessory or a component of the medical device. So the materials need to act as an effective microbial barrier. It's going to, again, protect your product, the sterility of your product from being compromised. And you need to make sure that those materials are compatible with worst case sterilization. So if it's going through a radiation sterilization method, the maximum dose that your product might see during routine processing. If it's going through a gas-based sterilization like ethylene oxide or steam, it has to be compatible with multiple sterilization cycles that you might want to consider validating during your sterilization validation. The packaging system should be designed to maintain the sterile barrier, protect the contents, the user, and the patient. And then it needs to also be designed to be usable or for aseptic presentation, to be able to present it to the sterile field without contamination. And then the performance of your packaging system should be able to perform through the standard handling, distribution, and storage of the product. And that includes stability or a shelf life study as well. So typical test flow for ISO 11607, max dose sterile package and product. Again, you're going to want to run these samples through that max dose. So radiation is at or above the maximum routine dose that your product might see. If it's going through ethylene oxide, it's going through 2x or 3x sterilization, whatever it is that you're validating as part of your sterilization validation. So you're going to do some baseline testing, and this can be the distribution testing is often considered the baseline. So you can have separate baseline samples as well if you prefer to go that route. Within that testing, you're going to do packaging performance testing. You're going to do product performance testing to ensure that your product functions. And you're going to do a usability evaluation, again, making sure that your packaging allows for aseptic presentation of your product. And then you're going to do a stability study or an aging study. So you're going to do an accelerated aging study and a real-time aging study. Again, doing that packaging performance to make sure your sterile barrier has been maintained. And you're going to do product performance as well to make sure that your product functions as intended. So talk a little bit about distribution testing. This testing is meant to simulate the kinds of forces and damaging types of forces that might occur during a standard shipping cycle. This is typically done with a series of tests, the first of which being an environmental conditioning stage. This is going to stress your package to the extremes of temperature and humidity that you might expect your product to see during shipping. It's also going to include drop testing, meant to simulate a delivery person dropping the package, during the handling of the package and the shipping. A vibration simulation. These vibrations will mimic the types of vibrations seen on trucks, on airplanes. There's rail cars and container ships and all sorts of vibration profiles that we can follow depending on the exact type of shipping that your product is going to see. There's going to be some compression testing as well to show that your box can withstand the forces of having additional packages stacked on top of it. And there'll be an altitude simulation test if your product is non-breathable. If you have a breathable package, the altitude simulation is typically able to be skipped. So you're also going to do stability or aging testing. As we talked about a few moments ago, there's baseline testing at time 0. This will be your product comes through your worst case sterilization process and goes immediately to testing. Sometimes people will use their distribution samples as their baseline as well. Most people will do accelerated aging, technically not required. The real-time aging is required per ISO 11607, but almost everyone does accelerated aging. Typically, you would do the ultimate shelf life you want to achieve. Say you've got a 5-year shelf life for your product, and there will typically be at least one, if not more, interim time points as well, just to give you some additional data. And that would apply for both accelerated and real-time aging. Real-time aging is exactly what it sounds like. It's if you have 5-year shelf life, it's going to sit for 5 actual years, followed by some package testing. For accelerated aging, the higher the temperature you perform the aging at, the faster that acceleration will be. So a couple things to consider. The ISO standard for the ASTM standard for accelerated aging, which is F1980, now recommends using realistic relative humidity for your accelerated aging. Previously, it recommended using lower relative humidity, but since 2021, it recommends using 95 or 45 to 55% RH for your relative humidity. It does give you the caveat that you can define something else if you have data to support using a different relative humidity, but it does recommend using 45 to 55% RH at this point. And then if you have a defined storage condition, say you have to store your product between 20 and 30 C, the upper defined storage limit should be used in the calculation for your accelerated aging as the ambient or the ambient condition for that calculation. So that calculation is going to use both the temperature that you're performing the accelerated aging at, as well as that ambient temperature. So if you got 20 to 30 C for storage in your product, you're going to want to use 30 C for that ambient, as opposed to like a 23 C that many people will use. So after the distribution simulation, or after the aging or stability testing, you're going to move into package integrity testing, package performance testing, and that falls into a couple different categories. There's strength testing and there's integrity testing. So the first thing that is often done is a visual inspection. And this is an integrity test. It's really meant to be a precursor to other tests. During this inspection, you're going to identify visually any potential points of failure for further testing. Some other integrity tests include a bubble leak test, where you submerge the package underwater and inflate it with air and observe for steady streams of bubbles indicating a channel through a seal, or perhaps a pinhole, or any sort of breach in your sterile barrier. There's also dye penetration testing as an integrity test. This is where you would inject a purple dye into the pouch or the package and observe for that dye leaking through, again indicating a channel through a seal or some sort of breach in that sterile barrier integrity. The most common seal strength test that we see is a peel test. This is where you're going to cut a segment of each side of the package and pull those two sides of the package apart, measuring the amount of force required to do so. So again, visual inspection, here's the types of things that you might see. You might see foreign particles, you might see non-uniform seals, wrinkles, channels, things like that. Trained operators are going to be able to see these types of things, but again, it's usually useful to help support subsequent testing. Here's that bubble leak test that I was talking about. So again, that package is submerged underwater. It's inflated with air. And you can see there a steady stream of bubbles emitting, showing the location of a pinhole in the package. So here's some dye penetration. Again, you can see we inject that purplish blue dye, and you can see that channel clearly through the seal area of that pouch, indicating a breach of that package's integrity. And here's peel testing. Again, this is a segment of one of the sides of a package that has been cut out and then pulled and the force measured. So this one's nice because it gives you some variable data, so quantitative data that you can do some statistical analysis on, whereas the integrity tests are more of a qualitative sort of pass-fail type test. So ASTM F88 is the peel test standard, and there's been some recent updates to that. There was an addition to allow for flexible to rigid material, so like a thermoform tray. Most people were using the standard for that type of testing previously, but the standard didn't specifically call it out. It now does. The other addition is suggested techniques depending on the packaging material. These pictures here are straight out of the standard. You can see underneath where it talks about the typical use. So flexible to flexible or flexible to semi-rigid. Again, talking about the different types of packaging that would make sense to use for the different types of test methods here. All right, I'm going to hand it over to Phillip Roxby now to speak about medical device testing at our Galway, Ireland facility.
Thanks, Nate. As mentioned, I'm Phillip Roxby. I'm the Technical Services Manager here in the Galway site. We are a mechanical test laboratory who service both the medical device and pharma industries. We not only focus on the packaging side of things, but also the device testing side of things. We provide technical services throughout all phases of the product lifecycle. We are a 17025 accredited lab with over 60 tests on our scope of accreditation. Our customer base is mainly in Europe, although we have some clients in the US. So in addition to the standard packaging validation test offerings that we perform, we also provide a range of additional services. And these services tie in with projects that often include a tailored package test or tailored device test. These tests are tailored to a specific customer's need. They can involve enhancing a standard derived test, such as one of the dye tests or peel tests. And in some cases, they can be completely novel test processes that are developed. These unique tests usually include device-specific tooling or fixturing, and we also develop much of the required documentation to conduct these tests, such as test protocols, test methods, and test method validations. So a test method validation is an approach that is used to formally challenge or prove the robustness of a test method. It is conducted by analyzing the variation in the measurement system of test data. The test method validations, while they're not always successful the first time conducted, the results provide a key insight into how the methods can be improved and areas that should be focused on. The data also provides a baseline to compare any future changes to a method. And once a method is validated, you can be confident that your test data is reliable and that the method is fit for use. I spoke about error. Typical sources of error originate from the operator, from the equipment used for testing, and also the method. And the test method validation facilitates the identification of the error sources. And once you mitigate those sources, it helps prove that the error has been minimized. There are a number of ways to approach a test method validation. By far, the most common we would see is the gauge R&R statistical approach. It's a technique that's widely used to analyze test data. The purpose of it is to determine the repeatability and the reproducibility of a study. Repeatability is the variation between successive measurements of the same part or trait by the same person using the same equipment. In other words, one operator's ability to get the same result on the same part every time. Reproducibility, on the other hand, is the variability between measurements of multiple operators when testing the same group of objects, using the same measurement systems under the same conditions. The type of gauge R&R study is determined by the test category in question. So here on the slide, we've listed a number of different gauge R&R techniques. The first being a crossed technique, And this is typically used for a variable, non-destructive test method. For example, a dimensional check. So a test where you are not breaking the part once by conducting the test, meaning that you can repeat the same measurement again and again and again on the same part. The nested gauge R&R technique is more commonly used for variable destructive test. And this would be a test such as the peel test that Nate spoke about earlier on packaging seals. Once this test is completed, it cannot be performed again and requires this slightly alternative statistical approach to the analysis of the data. Attribute gauge R&R testing by definition is for attribute testing. These are tests like the dye testing or the bubble leak testing Nate spoke about earlier, where you don't have a result in a numerical, you don't have a numerical result, you've got more of a pass fail or leak didn't leak type of result. And that's where this alternative approach is required to validate the test method. And as with all topic statistics, there are an endless selection of additional approaches that can be used. Listed a few here. ANOVA is one that's commonly used, where results, where data sets can be compared through means, and also compatibility studies can be used to check the reliability of your process. So when I get onto device testing, there are a number of different categories that can be looked at for device testing. While they may not be applicable to every device, these 8 should be considered thoroughly for almost all healthcare devices. I've taken an intravascular balloon dilation catheter as an example here, which covers a lot of these categories, and I'll talk through some of the examples of test types that you would typically perform. So taking non-functional, you would, when dealing with a device like this, the non-functional aspects that you would be interrogating could be corrosion resistance, dimensional specifications, or even the legibility of the markings, for example, the volumetric markings on the syringes. Functional testing gets more into how the device performs and how successful the physician will be at using the device. Typical tests would include simulated use or bringing in an element of force measurement through deployment, track or removal testing. You can have stent accuracy or stent deployment accuracy tests, which would be how accurate or how accurately the stent can be positioned. And in addition to that, Luer testing would be key here, as you can see there are a number of Luer components that are work associated with the assembly. Mechanical testing then applies to the vast majority of devices and delivery systems. Typical tests would include bond, tensile tests, delivery system torque tests, and in the case of a balloon, you have pressure and leak tests. With a stent, pulsatile fatigue testing is a common approach to determining that stent integrity remains throughout the life of the stent inside a body. repeated use can be applied to delivery systems where more than one use may be required, or more than one inflation. When a medical system has an electrical element, electrical and mechanical safety testing is brought into play. These are typically conducted according to ISO 60601, and the standard sequence testing, push testing, impact testing, mold stress relief testing, and in some cases electromagnetic compatibility testing. And finally, here I've listed biocompatibility, and I'll speak about it in a little more detail further on, but this is essentially assessing the impact to the patient with the materials used in the device. So the first example of a test I'll show here is catheter balloon burst, and this test pressure to the balloon, the standard use of the and associated with an accelerated or relay. Are we proving that the device can withstand burst pressure, but it also devices burst pressure capable and proving that over time ensure force to deploy is another test that is often used as a mechanism to assess the safety of a device. A delivery system with a stent tracking through a tortuous path. We simulate this on a horizontal tensile tester as seen in the image on the left, where a track model is located in a temperature-controlled water bath, which is controlled positioned in the test bed, and the test system introduces the delivery system through the tortuous path and measures the reaction force down the delivery system, again proving both safety and efficacy of a device. Luer connector testing, another area of testing in it's the previously mentioned tests, chapters to proving compliance of a Luer, and a Luer being a connector found as a syringe or a needle or a catheter. The first step is to prove dimensional compatibility with the ISO 80369 standard. You also must prove material compliance, and finally performance testing. And performance testing involves 6 different tests, including pressure decay, vacuum, stress cracking, axial loading, unscrewing torque, and clockwise overriding torque. Biocompatibility. Biocompatibility is a requirement which is derived from ISO 10993. FDA submissions require that materials in a device must be assessed based on the nature and the duration of contact with bodily tissues. These studies typically include a complete biological risk assessment. Biological testing may be required based on that risk assessment. Tests, for example, cytotoxicity, sensitization and irritation, or pyrogenicity are used to determine the level of risk associated with a material. In some cases, chemical characterization may be required depending on the novel nature of the material used and how much data there is to back up previous tests from previous tests. It's important to remember that all processing completed on the device by the manufacturer can impact biocompatibility. And that's it for me. Thank you for listening to our presentation. And if you have any questions in relation to packaging or device testing, feel free to reach out to myself or Nate for further information.